one of the 5,700 members of the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary serving in the Coast Guard's 1st District, Northern and Southern regions, it's an honor to introduce Rear Admiral Steve Poulin, Commander, 1st Coast Guard District. Admiral, it's good to have you spending some time with our auxiliary members today and lending your insight to the role of the auxiliary in the Coast Guard mission.
Great. Well, thanks for having me here.
Thank you, sir.
This is a real privilege for me. I've had the pleasure of working with the Coast Guard Auxiliary throughout my Coast Guard career, starting when I was a junior officer. And I've always admired the Coast Guard Auxiliary. They are indispensable to what we do and who we are as an organization. And when I got my orders to the 1st Coast Guard District and I thought about my commander's intent and what those key principles are that I think are going to be the keys to our success in the 1st Coast Guard District, I settled on vigilance, readiness, loyalty, and unity. And I really thought about the Coast Guard Auxiliary as I was putting those principles together.
Admiral, sir, you mentioned vigilance as on the auxiliary's part is something that's very important to your guiding principles. Could you speak a little bit to that topic?
Absolutely. When I talk about vigilance, what I'm talking about is standing atop watch. I'm talking about managing operational risk and never becoming complacent. And I think the auxiliary is doing a tremendous job embodying that core principle of vigilance. I look at what we're doing with the Maritime Observation Mission with our auxiliary airmen. I look at what we're doing with paddlecraft safety. I look at what we're doing by having auxiliarists standing the watch in command centers. I couldn't be more pleased with what the auxiliary is doing, helping us to remain always ready, Semper Paratus.
Admiral, sir, you mentioned readiness as one of your guiding principles. How does that apply to auxiliaries in the Coast Guard?
When I talk about readiness, I talk about it as applied to the entire workforce in the 1st Coast Guard District, active duty, reserve, civilians, and auxiliarists. And I talk about it from two different perspectives. I talk about readiness as professional readiness and then personal readiness. And this applies very much to the Coast Guard Auxiliary. When I talk about professional readiness for the Coast Guard Auxiliary, I'm talking about them doing something as simple as making sure they complete their core training. But then I'm also talking about making sure that they remain as proficient as possible to do the duties that the Coast Guard is going to ask them to do, irrespective of what that duty is. It could be operating a facility, going out on a patrol, doing a maritime observation mission, working in a command center. From a personal perspective, I think the auxiliarists make sort of a moral obligation when they join the auxiliary to make sure that in their personal lives they are always ready to put on the uniform and serve where the Coast Guard asks them to serve. So I just ask them to take a look at their personal situation to make sure that when the Coast Guard calls on them, they also remain Semper Paratus and ready to answer the call.
Sir, shifting topics for a moment, recreational boating safety is clearly one of our most visible and our most important aspects. How do you see this role expanding in our New England area auxiliary?
Well, we live in an area that has one of the largest boating populations in the United States. So what we do for recreational boating safety is critically important, not just to the boaters themselves, but to the safety of the waterways. And the auxiliary is a huge, huge force multiplier for the Coast Guard. We can't do recreational boating safety without the committed support of the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And we see increasing trends and risks that I think are going to task the Coast Guard Auxiliary or ask us to call the Coast Guard Auxiliary into new and unique ways. I mentioned at the outset watercraft and paddleboard safety. We enlisted the Coast Guard Auxiliary to do a lot of outreach for us. They're going to have to continue to do outreach. We need to get to suppliers, manufacturers, vendors, people that sell these paddlecraft to make sure that we raise public awareness of the risks inherent in operating any kind of craft on the water, including paddlecraft. So recreational boating safety, I think, is going to remain a core mission of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and I'm certainly going to rely on the Coast Guard Auxiliary here in the 1st Coast Guard District to do recreational boating safety. I'm talking to the Commodores frequently. I talk to Commodore Maluski, I talk to Commodore Cubitt, I talk with Commodore Formato. I really appreciate having those guys as part of the senior leadership team here in the 1st Coast Guard District. And I tasked them, I said, guys, tell me what service you can provide to the Coast Guard. I'll tell you what we need. You tell me what we can provide, and then we're going to marry these two together, and I think we're going to be an even better First Coast Guard district than we are right now.
Sir, you said that loyalty is one of your key guiding principles. How does that apply to Coast Guard auxiliaries?
This is a principle that I really feel passionately about because I think loyalty is what sets us apart as an organization. And when I talk about loyalty, I talk about three distinct components. The first component of loyalty that I talk about is loyalty to our core values of honor, respect, and devotion to duty. Anybody who wears this uniform, anybody who serves in the Coast Guard, irrespective of status, active duty, reserve, civilian, or auxiliarist, has to adhere to those core values. It's what makes us, I believe, the best organization in the world. It's what sets us apart. So the first aspect is loyalty to those core values. And that applies equally to the auxiliary as it does to any of the other elements of our workforce. The second aspect of loyalty is loyalty to each other. And again, this is something that applies equally to the Coast Guard Auxiliary. We have to be loyal to each other. What I mean by that is we have to have implicit trust in everybody else who's wearing the blue suit. We can only operate as a service doing the Coast Guard's business if we know that we can implicitly rely on each other. That's in the operational setting, that's in the administrative setting, it's who we are again as an organization. We have to be loyal to each other. The third aspect that I talk about with loyalty is loyalty to our communities. We have to be good neighbors and good citizens in the communities in which we live and work. And the auxiliary is the community. In many of our locations, they represent the community. They are a connection between the active duty force or the reserve force and the local community. So I think they're critically important to making sure that we uphold that aspect of loyalty. And I think the auxiliary also has another critical role to play. And this is one I really appreciate. They are really the upholders of our traditions, our service traditions and our history. I remember many of the units I was at, the local unit historian was a Coast Guard auxiliarist. All you've got to do is look around at the lighthouses we have in the 1st Coast Guard District, and it's auxiliarists who run those tours. Auxiliarists embody our service history and our traditions. That's loyalty as well.
Sir, it definitely seems like a team effort. Given the size of our current active duty Coast Guard and the very complex set of responsibilities that we accept, it seems that we're all going to have to work together to accomplish those goals. Is that something that applies to the Coast Guard Auxiliary?
Absolutely. My fourth principle in my commander's intent is unity, because I believe unity is so critically important for our entire workforce, again, irrespective of status. The job of maritime safety, security, and environmental stewardship is too big for just the United States Coast Guard, a single agency. We have to look to strengthen partnerships that we have, but also to build new partnerships with people and organizations who are committed to the same ideals that we are. And the auxiliary is a key part of that. They're a key part of that because they provide that conduit to the local community for us. They are the local community, as I mentioned before, but also they are a critical extension of the operational Coast Guard, and they are absolutely indispensable to everything that we do. Again, it's this unity of effort that I think the Coast Guard Auxiliary represents. And I'm so pleased every time I go to our Coast Guard units and I see an auxiliarist there standing the watch, or an auxiliarist underway on a facility. I get briefed every morning and I see the maritime observation missions that our auxiliarists are flying. That's part of unity of effort. It's bringing the whole together, because the whole is better than just the individual parts. And I also look at what we're doing here between the northern and southern regions. We're breaking down walls. We're finding ways to work better together between the northern and southern regions with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. That includes training. We're finding better ways to do business, and that's what unity of effort means.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral, for talking with us today. As we move into a new calendar year and very soon into a new and a busy boating season, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with the Coast Guard Auxiliary?
I just want to extend my personal appreciation to every member of the Coast Guard Auxiliary out there for their hard, dedicated, committed work. I feel very blessed to be the commander of the 1st Coast Guard District. This is a dream come true for me. To be up here in an area not too far where I was born, up the road in Maine. So to come back and have that historic and personal connection with this area, but also getting the chance to get back out in the field and work with our entire workforce, including auxiliary, is a real treat for me. And you know, we don't pay the auxiliaries a lot. They do this out of the goodness of their heart because they feel a need to serve, a commitment to serve. And I think that's one of the highest and noblest callings you can have. And so that's why I really appreciate what the Coast Guard Auxiliary does.
Admiral, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.